After several days, a tentative agreement was reached. House Baratheon and House Stark would bend the knee in exchange for pardons and seats on the King's Council. The atrocities committed by Aerys would be officially condemned. A fund would be established to aid those ravaged by the war, paid for from the royal treasury, much of which was supplemented by the Lannisters, who had waited in cautious neutrality until Tywin Lannister saw that Rhaegar might indeed hold the realm. In return, Rhaegar demanded that the remaining rebel forces stand down and swear fealty to the new regime. He also required that Robert formally end his betrothal claim to Lyanna, as she had chosen a different path. A deeply personal matter that left Robert seething but which he reluctantly accepted, for Lyanna's sake and for the sake of peace. The arrangement was not perfect, and many resentments simmered below the surface, but it was enough to halt the open bloodshed. Word spread through the Seven Kingdoms that the rebellion had ended, that King Rhaegar was working to restore order. Even the Iron Islands, restless as always, stayed quiet for the moment, waiting to see how the new king would fare. Dorne was appeased that Elia Martell would remain queen, and that Rhaegar had personally apologized for Aerys' earlier threats against her. The Reach, historically loyal to the Targaryens, breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that the dreaded wildfire plot had been averted. In King's Landing, the small folk experienced a mixture of hope and unease. They no longer feared a mad tyrant's wrath, but they also knew the realm was fragile. If Robert changed his mind or another ambitious lord rose up, the city could face war again. Through it all, Rhaegar carried the weight of his patricide like a hidden wound. He rarely spoke of the night he killed Aerys, but some nights it haunted his sleep. He was king now, and that role demanded a show of strength and resolve, yet inside he wrestled with the moral cost of his actions. The Seven Kingdoms still had lords who clung to old beliefs that kinslaying was an accursed crime that would bring the wrath of the gods. Yet others quietly praised him for doing what no one else had dared. The contradictory views swirled around him, and Rhaegar moved forward, determined to prove himself worthy in deeds rather than words. His greatest challenge, in the immediate sense, lay in making sure the settlement with Robert Baratheon held. Robert took a seat on the council but rarely appeared, and when he did, it was often to sneer at Targaryen suggestions. He drowned himself in ale and whored through the city with a fierce appetite, earning whispered disapproval from more pious lords. Yet Rhaegar tolerated Robert's excesses, seeing them as the boiling over of a frustrated man who had lost the single-minded purpose that had fueled him in war. While Eddard Stark stayed only briefly in King's Landing, long enough to see that Lyanna was settled comfortably, Ned was a calming influence on Robert, coaxing him not to break the fragile peace. Jon Arryn's guidance also helped, offering a fatherly perspective that sometimes tempered Robert's hot blood. Meanwhile, Rhaegar began reorganizing the City Watch to ensure no loyalists to Aerys might attempt sabotage. He also dissolved the Alchemists Guild's monopoly on wildfire, placing them under strict royal oversight to prevent any more caches from threatening the city's safety. The King's Council was reshaped to include men of various houses: Loyalists, Baratheons, Starks, Arryns, Tullis, so that no single faction could dominate. Tyrion Lannister, the younger son of Tywin, had not yet emerged as a political player, but Tywin himself was offered the position of Hand of the King, which he accepted, seeing an opportunity to maintain power. It was a delicate arrangement, for Tywin had resented Aerys for past slights and might harbor suspicion towards Rhaegar. But Rhaegar needed Tywin's gold and administration skills to help repair the damage of the war. As the months passed, the realm did not descend back into chaos, though it did not entirely heal either. Skirmishes broke out in some distant lands where loyalists to Aerys refused to recognize Rhaegar as king, or where resentful rebels saw a chance to ignore the truce. Rhaegar responded with a careful combination of stern enforcement and attempts at reconciliation. He believed in mercy, but he was not naive enough to let lawlessness fester. He traveled personally to key regions, meeting with lords, addressing their grievances, showing them that House Targaryen would no longer govern through fear. Even so, the memory of dragons and wildfire hung over every encounter. In the north, Ned Stark returned to Winterfell with Lyanna, who was physically recovering but shaken by the emotional turmoil of her role in the war. Rumors circled about whether she had truly loved Rhaegar, or been bewitched, or simply carried away by romantic notions. The truth was more nuanced than any rumor. Lyanna rarely spoke of it publicly, and Ned protected her privacy. But the stark words, "Winter is coming," took on a new resonance. The North had lost many good men to the conflict. They had no appetite for further bloodshed, so Ned accepted the truce with cautious grace. In Storm's End, Robert found himself the subject of speculation. Would he truly remain loyal to a Targaryen king? His fervent hatred had been what defined him. Now, without that single-minded purpose, Robert seemed adrift, indulging in hunts and feasts. His passions subdued only by the repeated insistence from Jon Arryn that stability was best for the realm. In time, Robert might find other outlets, or he might cause new trouble. For now, at least, he was not openly challenging the crown. All the while, Rhaegar did his best to rule fairly. He often visited the city's poorest districts, distributing bread and seeing firsthand the devastation left by the war. He began an ambitious project to rebuild the city's outer walls and repair the damage, employing many local laborers so they could earn wages. The presence of the king among commoners alarmed some, who feared for his safety, but Rhaegar insisted. He argued that the monarchy must stand with the people, not above them. Still, the new king's piety and earnestness did not erase the suspicion that lingered in some hearts. The Targaryens had a long history of cruelty and madness. Would Rhaegar's line prove any different in the long run? Elia Martell took on the role of queen with more public visibility, engaging with the ladies of the court, forging new diplomatic ties, especially with the women of House Tyrell and House Tully. She advocated for the poor and distributed supplies in Dorne's name to the capital. Her grace and warmth won her admirers, though she was physically delicate after the births of Rhaenys and Aegon. She became a symbol of the new Targaryen reign, a queen who had not forgotten the horrors inflicted on her family by Aerys, but who was willing to move forward in peace. Dorne, still bristling over the murder of Elaya's kin in the original timeline, found itself in less of a fury because Aerys was gone before he could truly provoke them further. Prince Doran Martell quietly observed from Sunspear, sending cautious messages of alliance, while Oberyn Martell simmered with restlessness, uncertain if vengeance was still required. But the direct threat to Elia was gone, and that was enough for Dorne to stand down for now. Gradually, life in the Seven Kingdoms moved on. The name Aerys II Targaryen became a curse on the lips of small folk, a tale of how madness nearly consumed the realm. King Rhaegar faced the monumental task of proving each day that he was not his father. Over time, some hearts softened to him, others remained wary. The open warfare had ended, but the realm had not yet found true unity. It was as though Rhaegar had placed a battered crown upon a cracked foundation, struggling to hold everything together while rumors of future storms lingered. One quiet evening, as the sun set over Blackwater Bay, Rhaegar stood alone in the Royal Solar, gazing out at the city. The harbor was filled with ships bearing trade goods, and the roofs below glowed in the orange light. People were returning to a semblance of normalcy, with the street markets bustling and taverns resounding with laughter once more. The war had touched every soul, but the promise of peace had lured many back to daily life. And yet, deep in his heart, Rhaegar felt the stirrings of the prophecy he had once pursued so fervently. The prince that was promised, the song of ice and fire, the danger from beyond the wall. He wondered if, in quelling this internal war, he had merely delayed a far greater threat. He had glimpsed in the old texts something about the Long Night and the White Walkers. But if the realm was not united, how could they ever stand against such a threat? These worries tugged at the fringes of his mind. He reached for his harp, which lay abandoned in a corner of the Solar. Felt like a lifetime since he had played. Carefully, almost reverently, he strummed a gentle chord. The sound was soft, poignant, as if acknowledging the burdens that weighed on him. He thought of Elia, of their 2 children, who might inherit the realm one day. He thought of Lyanna and the child she might bear as well, if the rumors were correct. He thought of the swirl of visions and lines of prophecy that had guided him here, to a throne gained through patricide and a tenuous peace. The notes of the harp trembled in the evening air, reflecting the complexities within his heart. He was no longer the prince who dreamed of songs and secrets. He was a king who had killed his own father to save countless lives. Right or wrong, it was done. Now, it fell to him to forge a future worthy of that terrible act. He was determined that his rule would not be marked by cruelty, but by justice, mercy, and a willingness to mend broken bonds. The realm had endured enough suffering. If the gods were just, they would allow him the chance to steer Westeros into a new age of peace. Outside, the wind stirred the battlements. If one listened closely, it almost sounded like the distant roar of dragons, or the quiet hush of a harp's chord. Rhaegar lifted his eyes from the strings and let the final note fade. A new day beckoned, and with it, the unending responsibility of rule. He set aside his harp and walked to the window. Torchlight glimmered across King's Landing, and from that vantage, he could see the city was alive with cautious hope, forging ahead one breath at a time. So long as he drew breath, he would protect them from tyrants, from madness, and from the hatreds that threatened to tear them apart. Whether prophecy deemed him the savior or not, he would serve as the king who broke the cycle of madness in House Targaryen. If the darkness beyond the wall truly existed, he would strive to unite the realm in time to face it. If the lords grumbled about the means of his ascension, he would show them, through consistent wisdom and compassion, that no more blood need be shed. And if the ghosts of the Mad King's victims whispered in the silence, Rhaegar would answer them in quiet determination. He had done what he must. Now let the realm heal. In the days that followed, Rhaegar began to plan a grand council that would bring together lords, maesters, and leaders of various factions from every corner of Westeros. It would serve as a forum to address the realm's pressing matters, succession laws, the fostering of children to promote unity, the distribution of resources to war-torn regions. He envisioned a royal progress through the Seven Kingdoms, to let the small folk see their new king, to listen to their plights. The old ways of tyranny and distant rule would not stand. He believed that if the Targaryens were to remain on the throne, they had to earn the loyalty of the realm anew. Some in the Red Keep whispered that he was a dreamer king, chasing illusions of a realm too big for any one man to govern kindly. Others saw him as the realm's best hope. Yet Rhaegar did not concern himself overmuch with these judgments. He had spilled his own father's blood to break the chain of hatred. That act would shadow him forever, but if it granted Westeros a chance at a stable future, it was a price he would pay 1,000 times over. As the weeks stretched into months, a fragile peace settled. Men who had once tried to kill each other learned to sit around the same table. The harvest season came, and the fields outside King's Landing turned golden. With the immediate threats receding, the city's laughter and bustle grew louder, taverns filled, and trade picked up in the harbor. The crown's gold reserves began to replenish under Tywin Lannister's stern financial policies, while Rhaegar personally oversaw the dissolution of the hidden wildfire stockpiles, ensuring they were rendered harmless or sealed away. The violent ghosts of the war had not vanished, but they were no longer tearing the realm asunder. Still, outside the capital, memories of the devastation lingered. Burnt farms, villages that had lost their young men to war. Orphans wandered the roads. Bandits roamed in the chaos left by the shifting armies. Rhaegar dispatched loyal knights to restore order, and to see that orphans were offered shelter in abbeys or holdfasts. He commanded that food stores be sent from the Crownlands to feed the hardest-hit regions. It was not enough to end all suffering, but it was a start. The dream of a unified Westeros, cleansed of old grudges, would take time to realize. Robert Baratheon sometimes roamed the city in the evenings, wearing a hooded cloak to hide his identity, visiting brothels or alehouses, attempting to recapture the thrill of the soldier's life. He rarely spoke to Rhaegar, though he remained on the council in name. On one occasion, after a council session, Robert lingered behind and approached the king in a deserted gallery. A hush fell between them, heavy with all that remained unsaid. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," Robert muttered, face cast in half-shadow. "For Lyanna, for all of it." Rhaegar's expression was pained, but he did not look away. "I understand. You do not have to forgive me, Robert. Only keep the peace, for the sake of the realm." Robert's hand twitched near the pommel of a dagger at his belt. For a moment, there seemed a flash of the old fury. Then he shook his head. "You killed your father to save the city. At least you had the courage to do that. Maybe that's worth something." With those words, Robert turned and walked away, footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Rhaegar stood there, absorbing the unspoken tension. It might never vanish. But as long as Robert kept his blade sheathed and adhered to the realm's new order, that would have to suffice. Lyanna Stark stayed with her family in the north, tending to her health and grappling with the emotional aftermath. Some said she mourned a child lost. Others said she carried a child still. Rumors abounded. The truth remained locked behind Winterfell's gates and in the hush of the crypts below. Whatever the outcome, that story remained intimately tied to Rhaegar's sense of prophecy. He wondered if the child of ice and fire would ever rise, or if fate had shifted course due to his father's early death and the change in the realm's destiny. He had read enough prophecies to know that the future was not always fixed. Each day, King Rhaegar greeted new challenges. Minor lords clamored for recognition, merchants sought trading rights, and the faith of the Seven wanted his assurance that heresy would not be tolerated. The complexities of governance threatened to drown him in details, but he persevered, trusting his counsel and his own instincts. Gradually, a semblance of normal rule took shape. New coins were minted with Rhaegar's visage, caravans began traveling with fewer fears of outlaws, and the next generation of knights saw a crown less tainted by madness. Yet the memory of that night in the King's Solar was never far from Rhaegar's mind. Sometimes he woke in the small hours, drenched in sweat, haunted by the gurgle of his father's final breath. Then he would quietly rise, pace the cold floors, and remember why he had done it. Ares would have burned them all. If not for that single terrible act, King's Landing would be ashes, and the realm would be locked in an endless cycle of vengeance. It was a dark solace, but a solace nonetheless. He had become a kinslayer to break the reign of fire and blood. As another year passed, the realm found a fragile calm. The rebellious lords had knelt. The small folk had returned to their daily lives. The roads were safer. Some young bards even sang of King Rhaegar the Redeemer, the man who saved King's Landing from wildfire, though others sang more cynically, calling him the Harpist King. Still others whispered that the realm might be in for another Targaryen meltdown if madness was in the blood. Only time would reveal the truth. For now, the once mad seat of power stood under a new sun, and Rhaegar found that, day by day, he believed more in the possibility of a lasting peace. In the back of his mind, however, he always remembered that winter would come, that threats beyond the wall might stir. He vowed that once the realm's internal wounds had healed enough, he would turn his attention to the north, forging alliances with the Night's Watch, ensuring that the kingdom would stand ready should the old stories prove true. But that was a worry for tomorrow. For now, the living needed a chance to breathe and rebuild. And so, in a rare moment of quiet, Rhaegar Targaryen walked through the gardens of the Red Keep, the setting sun gilding the stone walls in warm light. Flowers bloomed in pale clusters, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of lavender. He let out a slow breath, trying to ground himself in the simple beauty of the world, a world he had fought so hard to preserve. Down below, the city thronged with life. From a distance, a faint strain of music reached his ears, a street performer's lute or a wandering minstrel's voice. Once, Rhaegar would have yearned to join them, to strum his harp alongside them in anonymity, letting the music speak to his soul. Now he was king. His life was no longer his own. Yet perhaps, in saving the city, he had saved some remnant of that dream. One day, if the realm truly found peace, maybe he could again be the man who strummed a harp and sang of love and prophecy, free from the burdens of war. Maybe he could do so in a realm no longer overshadowed by madness and fear. The future remained uncertain, but it was a future nonetheless. A future that would not have existed had the Mad King's wildfire scorched everything to ash. Thus began the reign of Rhaegar Targaryen, second of his name, the king who killed his own father to save the realm, who forged a fragile peace from the shattered remains of rebellion. No one could say how the history books would judge him. But for the moment, the realm drew breath, unburnt, given a second chance at unity. And in that fleeting chance lay all the hope and peril a king could ever know.